Welcome to Murder Most Foul, a podcast devoted to exploring famous murder cases of our time. Some solved, some unsolved, but all fascinating and guaranteed to raise the hairs on the back of your neck. I'm your host, Jim Solanowski. Today's episode: a homicidal love story. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Murder Most Foul. My guest today is Ron Franscell, who has written a fantastic book. He is also a repeat performer, having been on my podcast before with his another one of his books, Shadow Man, and that's a fantastic book as well. And he's got a lot more, and we'll talk of that as we progress. Welcome, Ron.
Thanks for having me again, Jim. This is always fun to do.
Yes, and I should point out to my folks, I've been chasing you for a couple of months, as I often have to do. You were on a vacation, you were fixing something in your house.
We're traveling at different times. We got to stop doing that.
Right. So that's all okay. It's always, if it's worth anything, it's worth waiting for, and this was worth waiting for. The book we're talking about is called Alice and Gerald. Sounds harmless enough. The subtitle, not so much. A homicidal love story. And ladies and gentlemen, it comes up to its title. So we're going to get a little bit, we'll get into the book, of course, but let's first get into a little bit about Ron, his background, and also how he came. I'm always fascinated by writers who come by. I mean, if it's Ted Bundy, everybody knows about Ted Bundy, but the ones I love are the ones that, the books and stories that are not quite in the, 2020 and stuff like that, TV shows. So tell us about yourself, Ron.
I really like stories. Honestly, I have a lot of colleagues out here in the true crime writing who glom onto anything serial killer or domestic violence, and that stuff sells. It's a lucrative part of the genre, the lucrative part. But I want to tell stories. I want to have characters who change, characters that we both believe in and are rooting for, and characters who are as evil as the good characters. The greater the evil, the greater the good it takes to overcome it. So I'm looking for stories that embody that have colorful characters, that have colorful settings, that have complex things going on, not just a murder and bury the body in a shallow grave, or a serial killer. I'm not particularly fascinated by serial killers, except when they're the gas in the engine that's driving the story. I'm more interested in the person who woke up that day expecting the day to unfold more or less as it always does, and then something goes wrong, and something terrible goes wrong. I have this belief that the people who are reading these books are putting themselves in the place of those victims and of the investigators who are trying their damnedest to find the bad guys. They don't put themselves in the place of the killers. So they're asking themselves, what would I do in this situation? And I want to give them an honest account of how somebody did deal with it. For better or worse. Alice and Gerald, I think, is one of those kinds of stories. Where does that all come from? Well, mostly I was a journalist all my career, most notably as a senior writer at the Denver Post, and I was hired there to tell stories. A big thing in the business at the time was narrative journalism. In other words, telling completely true stories, but telling it in the narrative style where we do have characters, where we have dialogue, not quotes. We have some kind of arc going on. It's a completely true story, but we want to tell it in a way that people are accustomed to reading in novels. And that's what I do with my true crime books, is I'm writing a story, not just an account, not just a collection of facts, but creating a flow where a totally true story unfolds just as it did. But it takes a little more work to suss out all of the details and that sort of thing. In Alice and Gerald, there's a scene where Gerald is driving down the road, presumably with the 3 murdered bodies in the back of his pickup truck. And as I'm interviewing him about that, I'm asking all kinds of things, among them being, what were you listening to on the radio? So to the point that he's listening to something on the radio, I didn't make it up. I don't make anything up. When the moment you make up any single fact in a true story, it becomes fiction. So I ask a lot of questions, a lot of really weird questions. Do you remember what color jeans you were wearing that day, or something like that? But that's what adds color. And Alice and Gerald was a good example of the kind of thing. Of course, I had one of 2 killers at my disposal. We corresponded for 18 months. We did some interviews in the prison. Honestly, it's about asking questions and being observant, and not necessarily being creative in the sense that I can imagine what happened.
I think what is, again, which is fascinating in this, is that you do, and you told us about it, and that's not a spoiler alert, that you did get to interview Gerald of Alice and Gerald, and had some other correspondence, but the length and breadth of the story, how long it went on. It wasn't a quick kill, pardon the pun. It was a long, drawn out, and the couple lived long. They got chased, but the years. And I kept looking at the dates in the book. Now we're in this date. Now we're 2005,
right.
And so after all this stuff, you're sitting across from this guy. And we'll get to it as we tell the story about someone in my mind who is so, I don't want to get into, are they nuts? Are they crazy? Are they psychopaths, sociopaths? He did what he did. And Alice did what she did. And we'll talk about that. But one of the things that also drew me to the story, aside from its wonderful texture, and I tell this in all my podcasts, most times it's true, sometimes not. I want to hawk some books. But that we can't cover this in an hour, and we shouldn't, because this book is not, just the facts, ma'am, dragnet. It is incredible color of the place, which is important. Wyoming, and what was that like in 1969 when he arrived? And there's a lot in there that you might say, well, that's not the murder. Let me keep going. I didn't keep going. I read every page, because you can't understand the story and have some understanding of the people without it. The other thing that drew me to this, you said good and evil. I love it, because not only do we get some incredible pages and pages, I got notes here, pages and pages of evil, but the tenacity of the authorities, name after name. Somebody retires, somebody picks it up, someone else jumps in, and we'll get to the span of time that was, 10, 20 years, whatever, that it went on and on and on. That was on one, it's several murders, but it's 2 people. It's not Ted Bundy with 400 murders or 40 murders. And yet the tenacity pays off, doesn't get us totally resolved, and not any story can. So I'm now going to turn it over to you to get to lay us lay us
Lay it out.
into
You mentioned spoiler alerts, and I think that's one of the hallmarks of this particular book is that you don't have to read to the end of the book to find out who did it. I tell you up front who did it. It's there's no spoiler alert in that sense. I described Alice and Gerald as about a couple who separately and together murdered at least four people, probably five, as the book explains, and then lived happily ever after. In a more universal context, it's a story about a sociopathic woman's ambitious manipulation of a very submissive, desperate husband. But it's also about a series of really dogged detectives, as you said, who pursued this case for 40 years, but could never connect the right dots. You had one guy coming in and moving the ball down the field 10 yards and then being taken out of the game. And then eventually another guy comes in and picks it up, moves it along, he leaves. A series of very human stories about these detectives over about a 40-year span. And they are really kind of the heart and thread of this story. And of course, how it ultimately happens is just remarkable. But there's, like a lot of my books, this is about the ripple effect of evil acts. It's like dropping a pebble in the pond, and we see the ripple presumably forever. We see the bad in human behavior. That's a staple of true crime writing, of course. But we see the resilient side in Alice and Gerald, and that's not necessarily a staple of crime writing. It's nice when it's there, but it's one of those things that I'm looking for, is that human capacity to confront this kind of thing and then deal with it. One of probably the most important character is this activist grandmother who keeps the memories of three of these victims alive, her only daughter and her grandsons, for decades. She's pushing this story when, 2 and 3 investigators have fallen off the case. Not bad people, just something came up and they had to go someplace else. So the persistence of this woman, Claire Martin, literally spans decades, and her hope never really dies. And it falters, but it doesn't die. I think that readers would look at Claire and say, this could be me. This kind of thing could happen to somebody in my family. And I might be the person who has to keep their memory alive, who has to keep seeking justice against the odds. So altogether, all of these people, they're real symbols of good, of evil, of heartbreaking devotion. Like I said, it's a bigger story than a simple murder investigation.
and what and what is interesting, just as you were mentioning, of course, again, I can check these notes off as I go. Of course, Clara was on my list, and that it's hard now. Again, I read the book, and then way earlier on, and then when I, read it, I've read it again. And doesn't have to be an answer to this, but just as you explained it, it sort of is that the Claire's daughter Virginia and the two grandchildren are sort of, I feel, is the kernel of the evil, then we find through that two other murders. Well, one other murder for sure, and another death. Two, I
Yeah.
can just say that's not spoiler. Two husbands of Alice, which were before Gerald.
So I elected to tell it. The core murders in this case are of Virginia and her two sons. Virginia is the ex-wife of Gerald's. Um, the two boys were from a previous marriage, but he adopted them. They called him Dad. They called him Daddy. They were very young. Um, they divorced. Virginia did sort of the usual agitation for more child support and that sort of thing. Um, by that time, Gerald had married Alice, who was kind of a barfly, low end. In both cases, they had a number of marriages before, um, and Gerald was determined he wasn't going to be to lose another one, and he was going to do whatever it took to keep Alice. So he's immediately desperate to do anything she wants. He doesn't anticipate truly that she wanted him to kill Virginia and the two boys. But at some point, when Alice has had enough of that, she demands that he do that. And of course, he does. He takes them out, presumably on a plinking trip to shoot rabbits or birds, um, but shoots them all with the gun they had brought along, piles them in the back of the vehicle, and takes them home, where he transfers them to his pickup truck, which he then drives out into the middle of, literally the middle of nowhere in Wyoming, and throws them down an old abandoned mine shaft. Once they're reported missing, Gerald starts to get nervous that they'll be found. So he goes back to that mine shaft about, I believe, 6 weeks later, retrieves the moldering bodies, puts them in two barrels, and then takes those barrels out to one of the deepest lakes in North America, high and deep, and throws them in. That's Gerald's story. And that's the story we tell. By this time, Virginia and the boys are missing. The local sheriff in Fremont County, Wyoming, gets involved, but they have no evidence. There's plenty that suggests looking at Gerald, but they have no smoking gun. And that investigation goes on for several years. In the meantime, Gerald and Alice move to Missouri and settle on a farm. The investigation ultimately goes nowhere. The investigator moves up. He's elected sheriff, and suddenly he can't do it anymore, and it's a cold case. It's on the shelf. A few years pass, and another investigator comes along for that department and pursues it pretty well for several years. But then he has a problem. He overdoses on cocaine that he steals from the evidence locker in his office. So he loses his job, loses everything. But of course, that investigation is done. In both cases, the grandmother is a driving force in keeping everything moving forward. Ultimately, she convinces the state Division of Criminal Investigation to get involved, the state level of the FBI sort of thing. And they then begin to pursue it. So this goes on and on. Meanwhile, Gerald and Alice are living a good life. They've become truckers. Alice has become a lay nun in the Carmelite sisterhood. Gerald himself took classes in painting from the Bob Ross School and became himself a certified Bob Ross painter instructor. It just goes on like that for decades. Nobody can connect the dots. No investigator, try as they might, can really stay with the investigation long enough to find evidence that might not be there. There's no evidence that they have heard nothing about the barrels in the lake or the mine or anything else. They've got nothing.
But we should point out, just to keep in that, it's like, well, there's nothing there, but the car, the truck, or I forget whether it was with the body or whatever, or it belonged to Virginia, that's discovered empty, like almost in a lake or whatever. And so they've got that, but no forensics, there's no blood in it. And it gets
Nothing.
turned back to what? To Claire? Or to somebody gets
I think they turn it back over to the mother, who doesn't want it, and I think it stays in a junkyard. It was her station wagon that they had taken
used
out on the little hunting trip,
right.
and which Gerald had transported the bodies back to his house.
Right.
But then and it turns out Alice had taken that station wagon up into the mountains, tried to push it over a cliff, but it kind of rumbled over a boulder and got stuck. So they just left. And it was discovered sometime later, but there was no evidence, no physical evidence that they could find. And so I guess the best way to sum this up is it's in the 2000s now. This murder happened in 1980. It's in the 2000s now, and the investigators are as flat-footed as they ever were. There's absolutely nothing. There's some suspicion about Gerald, but they've got nothing. Out of nowhere, one of Alice's children from one of her prior marriages comes forward and tells a weird story. Alice, it turns out, during his childhood, when he was 12 years old, as a matter of fact, they lived in Laramie, Wyoming, and she worked at a small roadside bar way out away from town, out in the hills. His job as a 12-year-old was to drive her out to the bar, sit in the car while she worked her shift, and then she would come back to the car at the end of her shift with a 6-pack of beer, and they would share it on the drive back to town. 12 years old. At one of these times, he remarks, Mom, you suck as a parent. Alice retorts in one of the more tender communications between a mother and child. Son, several years ago, I killed a man because he crossed me. And I buried him right out here in an old mine shaft. And so just keep that in mind next time you say that I suck as a parent. That naturally stuck with him now as a grown man. He comes forward and says, "My mother told me this story once." He doesn't know where this happened. He doesn't know any details. He doesn't know who this person might be. But um, an investigator at the time begins to look into it and finds that Alice's third, uh, I'm sorry, her third husband was a troubled, drug addicted Vietnam veteran that she had met. She was a nurse, by the way. She had met at a mental asylum in Wyoming, and they ran off and got married. It didn't last long, a matter of a couple months before she took matters into her own hands. Uh, Apparently. But what the investigator finds is that this guy disappears at a certain point from their trailer home in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and is never heard from again, never shows up anywhere again. He's gone. So he believes there's probably something to this. But again, um, he was a drug addict. He was abusive. He was a mean mother. But another dead end. So now we have another case that's hanging out there that's attached to them. Um, and yet with no evidence, nothing that we can bring out to bring them to court to answer for any of this. So uh, again, you're seeing in the book that story follow these various investigators trying to connect the dots, and they just are falling short. But what you see is the devotion of the investigators. Honestly, if something were to happen to my family, like a murder or something terrible happen, all of these guys, and one woman, as a matter of fact, are the kinds of investigators that you would want on your case because they didn't let go until they had absolutely no choice because circumstances had overtaken them.
What I just have a question to keep that in chronology.
Sure.
The when and if obviously all this gets rolled together, the death of Ron Holtz. But when did they start looking at that? And then because it's Alice, does that raise anybody to do any connection at that point, or are they two separate long time investigations?
Well, they know that Alice and Gerald are together. It's really kind of two separate cases out there, and there's no nexus except Alice and Gerald. Um, and Gerald doesn't seem to have been on the scene at the time that this kid was talking about anyway, because it's long before. But there are two things out there. They seem to have an ethereal connection, but there's nothing that anybody could put their finger on and say, these two things don't add up. But again, you have these investigators sticking to it, and that's that's one of the that's one of the threads that they are aware of, that they're casually pursuing, but it's hit a dead end. On the other side, we know that really almost from the beginning that Alice confessed this murder to Gerald the very first time they made love. Rather than sleeping with one eye open, Gerald thought, boy, an independent woman who knows how to use a gun. I love her. Uh, so uh, they are colorful people, to be totally honest. Um, So we know, investigators don't, but we know that Alice did the murder. She confessed it to Gerald. So the nexus, they're aware of this. Both of them know what each of them has done. To bring it to the spoiler alert moment, um, Gerald and Alice have a daughter who's grown now and had been going through a nasty divorce with her husband, who was fighting for custody. Her brilliant idea was just kill him. So she goes to Gerald, knowing what happened to Virginia and the boys, and very tenderly says, "Dad, if I wanted to kill him, how would I do that?" And they had a nice little chat, uh, but Gerald interjected, "Sweetie, killing him isn't that hard. How do you plan to get rid of him?" And there's more discussion, but Gerald starts the conversation. Well, you don't have pigs, so you can't feed them to the pigs. You're going to have to come up with something else. The daughter, who's aware of the investigations into her parents, ultimately becomes kind of a weird, perverse double agent. And so she goes to the cops and she reports this. Meanwhile, that earlier son has told cops, and they've pursued it to the point of actually digging in an old mine shaft in near Cheyenne, Wyoming, and ultimately finding the body that had been put there. So, state and federal agents go out to Missouri. They knock on the door. Alice isn't there, but Gerald is. Um, Alice isn't there, by the way, because she's down at the police station where they have arrested her for this murder. They knock on the door and they say, "Gerald, we'd like to talk to you. We've got Alice down at the station and we want to talk to you about this." Um, Gerald unburdens himself at that point. Um, but the case he describes is not the case they came to ask about. And in a great stroke of luck, uh, he essentially confesses to a case that they weren't coming to ask about.
No,
So
no, stop.
uh,
Stop.
we'll
No,
stop it right
stop.
there.
Stop. No, stop because there's so many little nuggets in the book. And one of my favorites, because now we're to that part where the detective, and again, he may have said this to you, doesn't matter. You know that's what's going through his head. As he's got this guy confessing to killing Kennedy, he's
Yeah,
sitting there going, okay, just keep don't bite your lip. Just smile, go along with it because we can get the other one later. But oh,
yeah.
this
We'll
is
come back to
interesting.
that one. Oh, and both the agents, had to put on their poker faces. But in fact, one of the agents told me the thing that's going through his head is, "Oh shit," you know. He's under the table with his cell phone, texting with a fellow agent, and I've seen these texts, and they're aghast. They're, "Oh my God, he's confessing to," you know. But they're just in the recordings of that confession. They're talking to him like a couple of old guys down at the bar and having fun and good old boys, and he's just merrily unburdening himself. Um, but that was the the break in the case that that most concerned us, Virginia and the boys, was ultimately a a lucky accident. Uh, They had nothing up to that point. There, it might have not ever really been investigated or proven otherwise. If Gerald hadn't just assumed that they were there to talk about something else.
And again, then at that point, which it's typical, of course, and because of what his relationship with Alice was, he decides, and we still, I think in the book, you sort of put forth your at least your opinion about, who was directly, was it after the fact? Did she help with the bodies? Did she actually do it? And he did nothing. There's all, it could be three different scenarios, but he starts wanting her not to go to jail. So he, at least in the beginning, is going to accept whatever she says to you in the other room. He's saying that's wrong. She didn't do anything. I
Right.
mean, that's sort of the.
Well, he part of his personality, part of his psychopathy was this outsized sense of responsibility. He was John Wayne. His job was to protect everybody. And he did protect Alice. We now know that Alice participated at least in the cover-up, possibly in the disposal of bodies, uh, and we know that John Wayne feeling only goes so far because Alice died here a couple of years ago, and Gerald sat down and wrote me a letter confessing that he didn't know anything about these murders and that Alice had done everything. And that he didn't know where they were buried, or she never told him. It's part of Alice's psychopathy. It's part of her narcissism and her sociopathic nature that she had to tell. The reason she told that 12-year-old son about murdering a man earlier is partly to celebrate her brilliance as a murderer. That was important to her as a narcissist, that he knew what she was capable of. So had Alice actually murdered Virginia and the boys, she would have definitely told. Remember, she told Gerald about the murder of the former husband on the first night they made love. It was again part of that narcissism. So, had Alice actually killed Virginia and the boys, um, she would have told Gerald everything. She would have taken him to the plays. She would have, because it was part of celebrating her brilliance. It's a narcissistic trait that she wouldn't have been able to avoid.
Well, and we can't leave without throwing in Don Prunty. Let's talk
Yeah.
about, come on now, come on, you're leaving stuff out here. Okay.
Well,
Tell us about Don Prunty.
once all the dots are connected to this point, we have four people dead, and Alice is at the center of all of it. Um, by this time, Alice is convicted of the veteran's death. Gerald has confessed and is convicted of Virginia and the boy's death. The investigator says, "Gee, whatever happened to husband number two? He died at 42 years old from some weird things." So they exhumed the body. They did testing on whatever they could do. It was inconclusive to the degree that there wasn't much there. But there was enough there to say that the body had contained ethylene glycol or antifreeze. At some point in that husband's life, Alice had told her daughters, again, remember this narcissism, had told her daughters that she was going to stop his alcoholism. He was a terrible alcoholic. but she was going to stop it. She was going to stop his drinking. Well, I think that were some words to that effect. He then turns up dead within weeks. It looked to the doctors in the small town hospital in Wyoming that it was some natural causes. The autopsy much later, the forensic autopsy much later, is where they suggested it was probably poisoning by antifreeze. So we're gonna put that notch in Alice's gun, um, uh, because it makes more sense than what we were told at the time. So uh, Alice didn't face any charges in that. There wasn't enough there to bring charges, but she was already in prison for life. Gerald was in prison for life. Wyoming is a small state. They have a women's prison, they have a maximum security prison, and a brand new medium security prison. Gerald was in his 70s, so they put him in the medium security prison. The medium security prison is also where the geriatric facility for the prison system is. Alice, who was suffering from some diabetes and some other ailments, was transferred to the geriatric. She laid her head on the pillow less than 10 yards from where Gerald laid his every night, but separated by thick walls. They never saw each other again. And they could communicate by letter. I don't even think they were allowed to talk on the phone, but they could communicate by letter, but they could never be within each other's company. I used that myself. Nobody believed the authorities, the forensic psychologists, me, that Gerald disposed of the bodies in the lake as he said he did. A radar sonar search of the lake found nothing, and it would have been pretty starkly obvious. So I proposed to Gerald that if he would tell me where the bodies really were, that I would use my whatever leverage I had to lobby for a short visit with Alice. And it could be the last time he ever saw her. She was dying, but they would see each other for a last time. He wouldn't do it. He didn't want to make that deal. That, briefly, made me think that, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they really are in the lake, because he said, I've told you. I don't have anything more to tell you. But the forensic psychologist that I was working with, I told him the story. He said, oh, no. He says, all that means is that he's more afraid of disappointing Alice than he is interested in seeing her again. So he looked at it. I can see her or I can disappoint her. Which do I want to do? Well, he came down on the side of, I don't want to disappoint her. I will give up seeing her for that.
Now, let me just wrap up here with a couple of quick questions. You've really covered this well. One of the things that we sort of we didn't gloss over, but that people can read it in the book. But it impacts you visiting with at least Gerald. You recount how the kids and the wife were killed. and you recount how the boys were alive and saw their, or at least one, I believe, saw the mother shot and go down.
Yes.
And there's a good chance, the kids couldn't have been shot simultaneously. So boom, boom, maybe one was around the
Yeah, I
car.
think he
Well,
shot the
yeah.
mother
Why don't you tell
first.
exactly? I'm paraphrasing. Why don't I take it?
Yeah. It was interesting during our conversation. Gerald came off as this kind of charming country boy guy, like your uncle who tells bad jokes and laughs at all of them and says, "Pull my finger," and it's just a. That's the way he was with me. He wanted to sing these songs, but he didn't have a guitar, so he just sang them. Um, we were good buddies. We trusted each other, in his view. When I came to the point of asking about the actual murders, it was like a veil came down, and he was very different, almost just reciting from rote a story that he'd memorized a long time ago and had been telling ever since. That again didn't give me confidence that it's exactly what happened. Um, but uh, his story is that they go out into the prairie to shoot rabbits or whatever, and as they're getting the gun out of the car, he shoots Virginia first. He stands behind her and just shoots her in the head. Both boys witness that. The one boy is standing there and Gerald turns the gun on him and shoots him in the head before he can really even move. The other child ran down the road, ran into a drainage canal that was near the road, and Gerald just followed him and shot him in the water, coldly. And the way he described it was cold. And we had that conversation. I told him, this is just cold. You have no feeling in all of this. I think that led to a discussion about remorse, and sort of classically said that the only thing he really regretted was that he didn't stick to his plan, which was tell only one lie. The more lies you tell, the more difficult it is. So tell only one lie. And I think the lie was going to be what they did, what he did in the murders. Obviously, more lies had to be told, and they just piled up, and that's ultimately what led to his, capture. But uh, uh, he was cold. Now, I don't think he started as the sociopath or the psychopath that Alice was. I think Alice was the natural born sociopath. I think she, as part of her expert manipulation, convinced him to do her bidding. Um, and he became a sort of adoptive sociopath. He came to it later, because I think up to that point we see nothing in him or his behavior. He's kind of a big doofus, but he would do that for love.
So, like I said, there's no proof, certainly now, with Alice gone, there's no proof one way or another. But the point, I think, it's not one of those cases where you could say, well, this happened. And like even with the case, she has all sorts of reasons why she shot the other husband. And then first he was going to go after the baby, all this stuff. So there's no proof. In this case, obviously, Virginia is shot first. One boy is shot there at the scene, and another one's in the. You can't disagree with that. So unless you're going to say it was some stranger wandering the woods, one of those two people that you write about, you met, one of them face to face, and we've got all this information in the book, this color about them. One of them was this depraved.
Yes. And, they are, there's no question about the evil. And it doesn't bear parsing it out and trying to assign this or that to that helps in the detail maybe of understanding, but they were both evil. But let me take you back to, we only got a few minutes here, but let me take you back to that grandmother who never let this case go away. And she reached old age, entered a period of dementia, died alone in a nursing home. Before she died, she had purchased burial plots for her daughter and two boys that remain unfilled, of course. Um, I want to say 6 weeks after she died, uh, those agents visited Gerald's house in Missouri, and the case broke wide open. So she never knew, at least on this earth, what happened. Yet she's as responsible for making justice happen as those dogged detectives were. They were the ones that went out and did the hard work, but she is the one that bore that cross and kept them focused. And to me, she's the hero of the story.
And it's a little bit of a sidelight, but someone to get closure. The relatives, I don't remember if it was a sister or a child of Ron Holtz, which is the
Yeah,
only case to be officially solved. They, agents, the old knock on the door, and so she got closure and had, when it was all done, obviously she had the remains that they got out of the mine. I'm assuming she buried them.
sure.
Um,
Yeah, she did. And the last I heard, she still had those remains. This father she never knew, that was returned to her. Another part of the heartbreak here. Uh, it's again, when we talk about that ripple effect of one act of evil, you see how she and Claire Martin, the grandmother, how these investigators themselves are haunted by this, by two people who just decided in their narcissism, in their greed, decided that they were going to kill people. It hasn't ended. That was, the first of those crimes was back, I think, 75. Then 1980, by 1980, we have the Virginia and the boys, and then the alcoholic husband in there, all before 1980. But here we are in 2025, and those ripples are still emanating from that one pebble dropped in the stream.
and you have spread those ripples. So, Mr. Franscell, for a wonderful hour we have spent, please enlighten my audience as to how they can. Well, you can buy your books anywhere you want. You can buy them on. You get mine at the library because my wife says I can't buy any more books. So, but you can do Kindle. I've done Kindle. I don't like it because the layout sucks. But Barnes and Noble, Amazon, you get books wherever you like to get books. But they can.
All of them are print, ebook, and audio. They're all out there on Amazon or wherever you buy books. They're available.
Have you recorded any of the audio, or do you get the professional guy?
I don't do it. I leave that to the professionals.
So
I'm terrible. I go to book events and they say, "Would you read from your book?" I do it, and I read what's on the page. but in my head, I'm saying, oh, that sentence was a little too long. Or I could have had a better verb there. Or maybe these two paragraphs should have
Oh, that's
been
great.
switched. And so it's a painful process for me. I can't imagine speaking out loud every word that I wrote and coming out the other side sane.
So, give my audience your website. That's the fastest way to go to you.
Sure. My website is ronfranscell.com.
That's
As I
complicated.
said, you can read all about the books. You can't buy the books there, but you can read all about them and you read my blog, things like that. All of the books. I've written 19 of them. So,
So I
right.
want to thank you again, Mr. Franscell, for a wonderful, wonderful. And I got a couple other books I want to cover with you. Hopefully, it won't take as long as it did last time, but I want to thank you again.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's always a pleasure to be here, and please ask me again.